The dust motes danced in the sunlight, streaming through Elijah Monroe's modest apartment window, illuminating a space that told the story of a life lived quietly but deeply. At 78, Elijah moved with the deliberate pace of a man who had learned that rushing only burns what little time remains. His morning ritual never varied. Coffee brewed strong enough to stand a spoon in, oatmeal with a sprinkle of brown sugar, and the careful arranging of his medications in their plastic organizer. The walls of his small living room held sparse decorations, a framed map of Vietnam yellowed with age, a single black and white photograph of young Marines huddled in jungle rain, and a shadow box containing medals he never spoke about. Visitors, if there had been any, might have missed them entirely. Modest testaments to extraordinary courage. Elijah's neighbors in the apartment complex barely knew him. Mrs. Garza from 3B would nod politely when they crossed paths by the mailboxes. The young couple in 2A had once helped him carry groceries up the stairs when the elevator broke down, but conversation died quickly beneath the weight of generational distance. To them, he was simply the quiet old man in 4C, another elderly resident living on a fixed income, invisible in the way that older people often become. None knew he had once carried wounded men through gunfire, that his hands, now gnarled with arthritis, had once drawn maps that guided soldiers safely through enemy territory. None knew that when he woke gasping from nightmares, it wasn't age that haunted him, but the faces of the 12 men whose names were inked in a notebook he kept in his bedside drawer. This morning, Elijah carefully buttoned his flannel shirt and brushed his thinning white hair. His reflection in the bathroom mirror showed a face weathered by more than just time, deep lines carved by jungle heat, monsoon rains, and the weight of decisions no young man should have to make. His eyes, though, remained sharp, a deep brown that missed nothing, even as the world increasingly missed him. He slipped his worn brown coat from its hanger, the same coat that had sheltered him through 2 tours in Vietnam, that still carried a small scar from shrapnel near the left pocket. The wool was softened by decades of wear, the elbow slightly shiny, the collar frayed but meticulously clean. Elijah treated it with the reverence of a uniform, though most saw only an old man's. Outdated jacket. The bus stop was 4 blocks away. Elijah walked slowly but steadily, nodding to the barista who never remembered him despite his weekly visits, passing the corner store where the owner watched him with suspicious eyes whenever he browsed but rarely purchased. The city moved around, him in busy currents, parting and reforming as if he were a stone in a stream, present but unremarkable. At the library, his sanctuary on Tuesday mornings, the young desk attendant greeted him with generic politeness. "Finding everything okay, sir?" she would ask, never waiting for his answer before turning to the next patron. Elijah would nod anyway and make his way to the history section, fingers tracing spines until he found books about wars he had lived through, written by people who had not. Sometimes he would find errors, dates wrong, operations mischaracterized, the messy reality of combat sanitized into strategic abstractions. He never corrected them. Who would listen to an old man in a worn coat? Today, checking his seldom-used email on the library computer, Elijah found something unexpected, a message from someone named Dr. Brennan at the Crystal Grove War Museum. The subject line read, "Vietnam Exhibit, Expert Consultation Request." His finger hesitated over the mouse. It had been years since anyone had sought his expertise, his memories, his truth. The email mentioned photographs needing identification, maps requiring verification, and a gala opening for donors and veterans. "Your perspective would be invaluable," it read, as if his life suddenly had currency again after years of depreciation. Elijah printed the email, folded it carefully, and slipped it into his coat pocket next to the frayed notebook. Outside, the city continued its indifferent rush. No one noticed the slight straightening of his shoulders, the momentary squaring of his jaw. For the first time in years, Sergeant Major Elijah Monroe had been remembered. For the first time in years, someone had looked past the old man to see the hero beneath the worn wool coat. The envelope sat on Elijah's small kitchen table, crisp and official, with the Crystal Grove War Museum's embossed logo in the corner. 3 days had passed since the email, and now this, a formal invitation delivered by courier, not just regular mail. He ran his thumb across the heavy paper, feeling its weight both physical and symbolic. Inside was an invitation card with gold lettering. The Board of Directors of the Crystal Grove War Museum requests the honor of your presence at the grand opening gala of the Echoes of Valor, the Vietnam Experience exhibit. His name was handwritten in elegant script. A personal note was paper-clipped to the back. Sergeant Major Monroe, your contributions have been invaluable. We would be honored by your attendance. Dr. Marcus Brennan, Curator. Elijah set it down and moved to his window, watching rain trace patterns down the glass. It had been nearly 50 years since anyone had addressed him by his rank with genuine respect. The telephone rang, startling him. Few people called his landline. Mr. Monroe, this is Dr. Marcus Brennan from the Crystal Grove War Museum. The voice was younger than Elijah expected, earnest and educated. I wanted to personally extend our invitation to the gala. The work you've done helping us identify photographs and verify the accuracy of our maps has been incredibly valuable. Elijah cleared his throat. Thank you for saying so. We'd like to acknowledge your contributions at the event. Many of our board members and donors would be honored to meet you. There was a pause as Elijah considered the prospect of standing in a room full of wealthy strangers, being exhibited almost as much as the artifacts behind glass. I'm not much for fancy gatherings, he said finally. I understand, Brennan replied, disappointment evident. But your perspective is something our guests should hear. These aren't just artifacts to you, they're your life, your memories. Memories, the word hung in the air between them, memories of mud and blood and the weight of a dying man across his shoulders, memories of drawing maps by flashlight while rain turned the ground to soup beneath him. The young man who delivered your invitation, Anthony, his grandfather served in Echo Company. Elijah's hand tightened around the receiver. Which platoon? Second, I believe. Name was Ramirez. Carlos Ramirez, Elijah said instantly. Good with a radio, always carried extra batteries. The silence on the other end held a kind of reverence. Yes, Brennan finally said, that's him. Elijah closed his eyes. Carlos had made it home, had a grandson, had a life after the war. I'll think about it, Elijah said. That's all I ask. And Sergeant Major, the car service is already arranged. Black tie is preferred, but whatever you're comfortable in is fine. You belong there more than anyone. After hanging up, Elijah opened his closet and pushed aside worn flannel shirts and faded sweaters. In the back, wrapped in plastic, hung his dress uniform from decades ago. He hadn't worn it since a funeral in '89. It wouldn't fit now. His fingers moved instead to the brown wool coat on its wooden hanger. That evening, Elijah took out his notebook, the pages soft and worn from years of handling. 12 names stared back at him, men who never got to have grandchildren, men whose stories were fading as surely as the ink on the page. Perhaps their names would be on a wall in that museum. Perhaps someone would pause and wonder who they had been. What do you think, boys? He whispered to the empty room. One more mission? The decision formed slowly, like sediment settling in still water. He would go. Not for the wealthy donors or the canapes or the recognition, but for Carlos Ramirez's grandson, for the 12 names in his notebook, for the truth behind the artifacts. Elijah called the number on the invitation, his voice steadier than it had been in years. Dr. Brennan. This is Elijah Monroe. I'll be attending your gala." "That's wonderful news, Sergeant Major." "Just one thing," Elijah added. "I'll be wearing my old field coat. It's seen me through worse than a fancy party." There was a smile in Brennan's voice when he answered. "I'd expect nothing less, sir. Nothing less." The rain had eased into a mist by the time Elijah Monroe reached the steps of the Crystal Grove War Museum. He paused beneath the awning, adjusting the envelope in his hand, his brown wool jacket softened by decades of wear, clinging to his shoulders, damp and heavy. Around him, luxury cars rolled up to the entrance, and guests in tuxedos and gowns swept inside beneath umbrellas held by chauffeurs. Inside, the lobby gleamed with marble floors and soft golden light. A string quartet played near a grand staircase. Servers in white gloves moved silently, offering champagne to men in cufflinks and women wrapped in silk. At the check-in table stood a young man in a crisp suit. His name tag read, "Connor Winthrop, Event Manager." His smile faltered the moment his eyes landed on Elijah. "Yes?" Connor asked, his tone clipped. Elijah held out the envelope. "I was invited. Elijah Monroe." Connor took the envelope hesitantly, as if it might stain his fingers. He opened it, scanned the name, and tapped quickly on his tablet. "You're not on the primary guest list," he said. "This looks like a courtesy invitation from Dr. Brennan." He looked up again, eyes flicking over Elijah's jacket and worn slacks. "This is a black tie event. Jacket and tie are mandatory. I'm afraid this attire doesn't meet our standards." Elijah said nothing for a moment. His hand dropped to his side. "This jacket has history," he said quietly. "I wore it through winters colder than this whole building." Connor didn't flinch. "Sir, I'm just enforcing the rules. Please step aside. You're holding up the line." Elijah stepped back without a word. Guests flowed past him, some casting curious glances, others pretending not to see him at all. He moved toward a corner near a velvet rope just beyond the main gallery. From there he could see the exhibit he had helped inspire, maps drawn from memory, photographs he had identified, moments he had lived. But tonight he was just a man in an old coat, watching from the outside. He straightened slightly, refusing to leave. Not yet. The hum of soft music floated through the museum's grand atrium, but Elijah Monroe stood still, just beyond the rope, as if frozen in a different time. Beyond the exhibit glass, images flickered, like ghosts from a life only he remembered. One photograph showed a cluster of Marines huddled in the snow, faces young and hard, eyes too old for their age. Elijah knew that image. He had lived just outside the frame. No one greeted him. No one asked his name. He was background noise, a misplaced figure in a space carved for curated memory, not lived experience. He shifted his weight slightly, the ache in his knees biting through the soles of his boots. A staff member passed without a glance. A woman with diamond earrings whispered to her husband, then giggled behind a manicured hand. "Still," Elijah said. "Nothing." His hand drifted into his coat pocket, fingers brushing against the frayed edges of a small notebook. Inside were the names of 12 men. His men. Some had fallen in the same ambush that nearly took his leg. Others had died later, lost to time, to silence. He had come tonight for them. "Sir?" a voice said quietly beside him. Elijah turned. It was a young man in a dark blue blazer, maybe in his early 20s. His badge read, "Mateo Alvarez, Security Trainee." He looked nervous, but not hostile. "Do you need assistance?" Mateo asked. "You've been standing here a while." Elijah gave him a tired smile. "I was invited, but the young man at the door didn't think I looked the part." Mateo frowned, glancing toward the check-in desk. Connor was laughing with a group of donors, gesturing animatedly with a flute of champagne in his hand. "May I ask your name, sir?" Mateo asked gently. "Elijah Monroe," he said. Mateo blinked. "Wait." Elijah Monroe, the Sergeant Major from Echo, Company, Vietnam. Elijah looked surprised. How do you know that? I studied military history in school. Your name came up in one of my lectures on battlefield leadership. My professor called you the man who never left a Marine behind. Elijah looked away, a flicker of discomfort crossing his face. That was a long time ago. Still, Mateo said, voice steadier now, you belong here more than anyone in that room. A pause, then Connor's voice cut through the moment, sharp and dismissive. Mateo, that area is restricted. Step away from the guest, please. Mateo hesitated. He's not just a guest. I said step away, Connor snapped, walking over. Sir, he added to Elijah, voice coated in mock politeness, we've asked you to leave the lobby. If you continue loitering, we'll have to involve security. Elijah didn't move. He looked Connor in the eye. I'm not loitering, he said. I'm remembering. The lobby was growing louder with each new guest. Laughter, camera shutters, and the clinking of champagne glasses filled the air like static, but in one corner, time had slowed, locked around an old man, a young trainee, and a line that had just been crossed. Connor's shoes tapped briskly against the polished marble as he approached, his smile long gone. I've already explained the policy, he said, eyes fixed on Mateo as if Elijah were no longer there. You're not authorized to engage guests who've been denied entry. This is a formal event. We can't have scenes. Mateo stood his ground. I wasn't making a scene. I was offering assistance. To someone who doesn't belong here, Connor hissed, now turning to Elijah. Sir, I need you to exit the premises. Elijah's jaw tightened. I told you I'm waiting for Dr. Brennan. He's busy with dignitaries, not drop-ins and surplus coats, Connor snapped. The insult hung in the air like fog. A few guests near. The bar turned their heads. A woman raised an eyebrow, whispering something to her friend. Elijah remained still, his fingers gripping the worn edge of his pocket notebook. I am not a drop-in, he said quietly. I helped build the exhibit inside. Connor rolled his eyes. That may be true in your mind, sir, but we have standards, and your jacket— What about it? Mateo interrupted, his voice firmer now. Connor ignored him. We have donors here tonight, board members. I'm not risking their impression of this institution over one man's story. One man's story, Mateo echoed. Elijah took a step back, shoulders straightening. His eyes didn't leave Connor's face. I've seen young men scream for their mothers while holding their insides in their hands, he said, voice low but steady. I've slept in rice paddies and carried brothers who bled out before sunrise. That jacket, it's got more integrity than half the tuxedos in this room. Connor's face flushed. Security will be called if you don't leave now. Just then, an older couple approached the rope nearby. The man paused, overhearing the exchange, eyes narrowing at Elijah. Is he lost? He muttered to his wife. No, she whispered. He's just in the way. Elijah's lips pressed together. In the way, he repeated. Connor raised a hand to signal someone near the front desk. Elijah glanced at the exhibit one more time, then he nodded slowly. I'll step outside, he said, if that makes it easier for you to forget. He turned, but not before Mateo spoke, this time loud enough for others to hear. You should be ashamed, he told Connor. You don't even know who you're pushing out the door. Connor scoffed. He'll be fine. People like that always fade back into the background. Elijah Monroe stood just outside the glass doors now, under the awning where the rain had returned. It wasn't heavy, just enough to settle into his jacket's shoulders, darkening the wool like a spreading bruise. He didn't light a cigarette, hadn't smoked in 20 years, but his fingers twitched the way they used to when waiting in silence, when he didn't know if the next hour would bring gunfire or calm. Some habits never left. Inside, the gala moved, on without him. The quartet played something soft and aimless. Waiters made their rounds again, and the exhibit, which bore his handwriting in places, his stories embedded in plaques, was now filled with guests who would never know his name. Connor had returned to the check-in table, laughing too loud. Matteo stood nearby, jaw clenched, eyes flicking toward the doors every few seconds, watching Elijah through the glass like someone left behind. Elijah thought about leaving. He could walk the 4 blocks back to the bus stop, take the late route home, reheat the soup he'd made the night before. He could disappear like he always had, quietly, with no confrontation, no fuss. He had done it before. But something kept his feet rooted to the stone. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was the 12 names in his notebook. Or maybe he was simply tired of being forgotten in places that wouldn't exist without men like him. He watched as a couple posed for a photo in front of the memorial display inside. The man mimed a soldier's salute. The woman laughed, fixing her pearl necklace. Neither looked at the wall behind them where the real heroes' names were etched in stone. Elijah's hand trembled slightly, from cold, from memory. He wasn't sure. Inside, Connor leaned toward a guest, gesturing toward the exhibit as if he'd built it himself. Matteo, unable to take it any longer, walked toward the doors again, but was stopped by Connor's glare. "No!" Connor mouthed. Matteo hesitated, and then a gust of wind pushed the doors open with sudden force. The room changed. Boots struck marble, steady, sharp, loud. 2 uniformed men stepped in first, scanning the crowd with military precision. Behind them walked someone taller, older, commanding. His uniform immaculate, his chest covered in medals and ribbons, shoulders bearing the weight of 4 silver stars. The string quartet trailed off mid-measure. Connor stood frozen. Guests turned slowly. The man didn't speak, not yet, but his eyes swept the lobby like radar, searching for something or someone. And then he saw him. Elijah Monroe standing in the rain on the other side of the glass. The general's face changed, and so did everything else. Matteo watched it all unfold, his back pressed against the wall near the velvet rope. He had been frozen in place since Connor's sharp rebuke, caught between obedience and the growing certainty that he was witnessing something profoundly wrong. Every instinct told him to help the old soldier outside, but his job, his first real job with benefits and a future, hung in the balance. His grandfather would be ashamed of his hesitation. Abuelo had served in the army, had told him stories of men like Sergeant Major Monroe, heroes who carried the weight of war so that others could sleep peacefully at night. "There is a difference," he had said, "between following orders and doing what's right." Matteo's eyes darted between Connor, who was now straightening his tie with nervous fingers, and the old soldier outside, whose shoulders remained square despite the rain soaking into his coat. The general was moving toward the doors now with purposeful strides. Making his decision, Matteo slipped away from his position and moved quickly through a service corridor that led to a side exit. The rain hit his face as he emerged into the night air, hurrying around the building's perimeter toward the main entrance. Elijah Monroe stood there still, a solitary figure beneath the museum's grand facade. Up close, Matteo could see the lines, etched deeply into his face, could see how his hands, weathered and marked with age spots, still held themselves with the disciplined steadiness of a Marine. "Sir," Matteo said, slightly breathless, "I need to apologize." Elijah turned, surprise briefly crossing his features. "You shouldn't be out here," he replied. "You'll catch trouble." Matteo shook his head. "It's wrong what they did. You're Sergeant Major Elijah Monroe. You saved your entire unit at Die Lock. You carried Lieutenant Benson through sniper fire for 3 miles after he was hit. My professor said your maps saved more lives than most medics." A faint smile touched the corners of Elijah's mouth. "And paid more attention in class than I would have at your age." My grandfather was at Khe-Sanh. He taught me to recognize real heroes. Matteo hesitated, then reached for the brass name badge pinned to his blazer. With quick fingers, he unpinned it, holding it out. I don't want to work somewhere that treats men like you this way. Elijah's eyes widened. He reached out, his hand closing not around the badge but around Matteo's wrist, gently pushing it back. Don't throw away your future on an old man's pride, he said quietly. It's not about your pride, sir. It's about mine. Before Elijah could respond, the museum's front doors swung open, spilling golden light onto the wet steps. The general stood in the doorway, his imposing figure silhouetted against the brightness behind him. Matteo stiffened instinctively at the sight of 4 silver stars. The general stepped forward, his gaze moving between Matteo and Elijah with calm assessment. Is this young man giving you trouble, Elijah? He asked, his voice deep and measured. Elijah shook his head. Quite the opposite, General. He's the only one inside who recognized what this coat has been through. The general's expression softened slightly. He extended his hand toward Matteo. What's your name, son? Matteo Alvarez, sir. Security trainee. Well, Mr. Alvarez, it seems you've got better judgment than your superiors. Matteo swallowed hard. I was just doing what my grandfather would expect of me. And who was your grandfather? Corporal Thomas Alvarez, 3rd Battalion, 26th Marines. The general nodded, respect evident in his eyes. He looked back at Elijah, whose soaked coat now clung to his thin frame. What do you say, Sergeant Major? Shall we show these people what real honor looks like? Elijah glanced at Matteo, then back at the general. Lead the way, Isaac, just like old times. As the 3 men turned toward the entrance, Matteo caught a glimpse of Connor through the glass doors, his face pale as paper. Something that felt remarkably like justice warmed Matteo's chest, despite the cold rain. The rain whispered against the museum's glass doors, but no one inside heard it now. The moment he stepped in, the air changed. General Isaac Hayes didn't need an introduction. He didn't wear power like a suit. It clung to him like a second skin. His boots struck the marble floor with purpose, each step echoing off the vaulted ceiling. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with silver at his temples and fire in his gaze. The 4 stars on his chest caught the chandelier light and held it. Conversations halted mid-sentence. Glasses hovered mid-air, heads turned instinctively like leaves toward the sun. Connor straightened behind the check-in table, suddenly stiff, his confidence draining with every step the general took. Hayes didn't smile, didn't wave. His eyes swept the room once, then again, until they found what they were looking for. Without a word to anyone, he turned sharply and walked toward the doors, not to the podium, not to the waiting museum director, but to the man in the rain. The crowd watched, silent, as the general reached for the handle and pulled the door open himself. Elijah, he said, voice deep and sure, you should be inside. Elijah blinked, caught off guard. Isaac. General Hayes stepped back, offering room to enter. I hoped you'd come. Didn't think you would. I almost didn't, Elijah replied. Guess I wasn't dressed for the occasion. The general looked him over once, then shook his head. You're dressed just fine. And then, in full view of the silent lobby, General Hayes stood tall, placed his heels together, and delivered a crisp salute to him, to Elijah Monroe, the same man Connor had kicked out moments ago. Inside, Connor's face drained of color. Elijah, after a pause, returned the salute slowly, his hand trembling not from weakness, but memory. The general nodded, then turned to the room, his voice ringing out clear and sharp. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm honored to be here tonight, but before we speak of history, I'd like you to meet it. He gestured toward Elijah. This man is Sergeant Major Elijah Monroe. He didn't just fight in the battles we romanticize. He survived them. He carried men through fire. He built the maps your exhibit is based on. Without him, half of what's in this room wouldn't exist." A hush fell. Connor took a small step back, and for the first time all evening, every eye in the room saw Elijah Monroe. Not the coat, not the age. The man. You could hear a pin drop. In the silence that followed, the whispers began like ripples across still water. "Is that really him?" a woman in pearls asked her companion, loud enough for others to hear. "I thought the veterans would be more presentable," replied her friend, adjusting her diamond bracelet. An older man with a glass of scotch sniffed dismissively. "Probably exaggerating his service. They all do." A younger couple exchanged uncomfortable glances. "Should we say something?" the woman whispered. "I feel awful." "Not our problem," her partner replied, tugging her toward the bar. "Let's get another drink." From his position near the wall, Matteo watched the reactions with growing disgust. These people had paid thousands for tickets to honor history while dismissing its living embodiment. They had applauded politely at rehearsed speeches about sacrifice, while turning away the man who had actually sacrificed. Connor remained frozen behind his desk, his tablet still displaying the guest list that hadn't included Elijah's name among the VIPs. His eyes darted nervously between the general and his supervisor across the room. General Hayes hadn't moved. He stood firm beside Elijah, one hand resting lightly on the older man's shoulder, his posture radiating a warning that no one dared challenge. The museum director finally approached, her high heels clicking frantically against the marble. She wore an expression that fluctuated between professional smile and panic. "General Hayes," she said breathlessly, "we're so honored you could join us. I see you've already met our—" She faltered, glancing uncertainly at Elijah. "Your guest of honor," Hayes finished for her, his tone brooking no argument. "Sergeant Major Monroe was just explaining to me how he was initially welcomed." The director's smile slipped further. "There appears to have been some miscommunication with our check-in procedures. I can assure you—" "It wasn't a miscommunication," Matteo said, stepping forward. He was turned away because of how he looked. The room fell silent again. Even the quartet had stopped playing. In that frozen moment, Elijah Monroe stood taller than he had in years, his worn coat suddenly seeming like the most dignified garment in the room. General Hayes stepped forward, his voice now directed at the museum director. "I think we should proceed with the evening's program, don't you? With one amendment, Sergeant Major Monroe will join me at the podium." The director nodded quickly, relief washing over her face at having someone take command of the increasingly awkward situation. She gestured toward the small stage where a podium stood illuminated by subtle spotlights. As they walked through the parting crowd, Elijah felt the weight of the small notebook in his pocket pressing against his ribs with each step. The leather cover was worn smooth from decades of handling, its pages yellowed and curling at the edges. He had never intended to show it to anyone. It wasn't meant for display, not like the artifacts under glass that people could admire without. Feeling their weight. At the podium, General Hayes spoke about valor, about sacrifice, about the bond between soldiers that civilians could never fully comprehend. His words were eloquent, practiced, the kind that belonged in marble halls like this. The audience nodded appreciatively, champagne glasses held at respectful angles, faces composed into expressions of solemn understanding. Then Hayes turned to Elijah. "I believe Sergeant Major Monroe has something more authentic to share than any speech I could give." Elijah hesitated. Public speaking had never been his strength. He had led men through gunfire and monsoons, but had always done so with actions rather than words. Still, he stepped forward, his fingers brushing against the notebook in his pocket. Abuelo had served in the army, had told him stories of men like Sergeant Major Monroe, heroes who carried the weight of war so that others could sleep peacefully at night. "There is a difference," he had said, "between following orders and doing what's right." Mateo's eyes darted between Connor, who was now straightening his tie with nervous fingers, and the old soldier outside, whose shoulders remained square despite the rain soaking into his coat. The general was moving toward the doors now with purposeful strides. Making his decision, Mateo slipped away from his position and moved quickly through a service corridor that led to a side exit. The rain hit his face as he emerged into the night air, hurrying around the building's perimeter toward the main entrance. Elijah Monroe stood there still, a solitary figure beneath the museum's grand facade. Up close, Mateo could see the lines etched deeply into his face, could see how his hands, weathered and marked with age spots, still held themselves with the disciplined steadiness of a Marine. "Sir," Mateo said, slightly breathless, "I need to apologize." Elijah turned, surprise briefly crossing his features. "You shouldn't be out here," he replied. "You'll catch trouble." Mateo shook his head. "It's wrong what they did. You're Sergeant Major Elijah Monroe. You saved your entire unit at Die Lock. You carried Lieutenant Benson through sniper fire for 3 miles after he was hit. My professor said your maps saved more lives than most medics." A faint smile touched the corners of Elijah's mouth. And paid more attention in class than I would have at your age. My grandfather was at Khe Sanh. He taught me to recognize real heroes." Mateo hesitated, then reached for the brass name badge pinned to his blazer. With quick fingers, he unpinned it, holding it out. "I don't want to work somewhere that treats men like you this way." Elijah's eyes widened. He reached out, his hand closing not around the badge but around Mateo's wrist, gently pushing it back. "Don't throw away your future on an old man's pride," he said quietly. "It's not about your pride, sir. It's about mine." Before Elijah could respond, the museum's front doors swung open, spilling golden light onto the wet steps. The general stood in the doorway, his imposing figure silhouetted against the brightness behind him. Mateo stiffened instinctively at the sight of 4 silver stars. The general stepped forward, his gaze moving between Mateo and Elijah with calm assessment. "Is this young man giving you trouble, Elijah?" he asked, his voice deep and measured. Elijah shook his head. "Quite the opposite, General. He's the only one inside who recognized what this coat has been through." The general's expression softened slightly. He extended his hand toward Mateo. "What's your name, son?" "Mateo Alvarez, sir. Security trainee." "Well, Mr. Alvarez, it seems you've got better judgment than your superiors." Mateo swallowed hard. "I was just doing what my grandfather would expect of me." "And who was your grandfather?" "Corporal Thomas Alvarez, 3rd Battalion, 26th Marines." The general nodded, respect evident in his eyes. He looked back at Elijah, whose soaked coat now clung to his thin frame. "What do you say, Sergeant Major? Shall we show these people what real honor looks like?" Elijah glanced at Mateo, then back at the general. "Lead the way, Isaac, just like old times." As the 3 men turned toward the entrance, Mateo caught a glimpse of Connor through the glass doors, his face pale as paper. Something that felt remarkably like justice warmed Mateo's chest, despite the cold rain. The rain whispered against the museum's glass doors, but no one inside heard it now. The moment he stepped in, the air changed. General Isaac Hayes didn't need an introduction. He didn't wear power like a suit. It clung to him like a second skin. His boots struck the marble floor with purpose, each step echoing off the vaulted ceiling. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with silver at his temples and fire in his gaze. The 4 stars on his chest caught the chandelier light and held it. Conversations halted mid-sentence. Glasses hovered mid-air, heads turned instinctively like leaves toward the sun. Connor straightened behind the check-in table, suddenly stiff, his confidence draining with every step the general took. Hayes didn't smile, didn't wave. His eyes swept the room once, then again, until they found what they were looking for. Without a word to anyone, he turned sharply and walked toward the doors, not to the podium, not to the waiting museum director, but to the man in the rain. The crowd watched, silent, as the general reached for the handle and pulled the door open himself. "Elijah," he said, voice deep and sure, "you should be inside." Elijah blinked, caught off guard. "Isaac." General Hayes stepped back, offering room to enter. "I hoped you'd come. Didn't think you would." "I almost didn't," Elijah replied. "Guess I wasn't dressed for the occasion." The general looked him over once, then shook his head. "You're dressed just fine." And then, in full view of the silent lobby, General Hayes stood tall, placed his heels together, and delivered a crisp salute to him, to Elijah Monroe, the same man Connor had kicked out moments ago. Inside, Connor's face drained of color. Elijah, after a pause, returned the salute slowly, his hand trembling not from weakness, but memory. The general nodded, then turned to the room, his voice ringing out clear and sharp. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'm honored to be here tonight, but before we speak of history, I'd like you to meet it." He gestured toward Elijah. "This man is Sergeant Major Elijah Monroe. He didn't just fight in the battles we romanticize. He survived them. He carried men through fire. He built the maps your exhibit is based on. Without him, half of what's in this room wouldn't exist." A hush fell. Connor took a small step back, and for the first time all evening, every eye in the room saw Elijah Monroe. Not the coat, not the age. The man. You could hear a pin drop. In the silence that followed, the whispers began like ripples across still water. "Is that really him?" a woman in pearls asked her companion, loud enough for others to hear. "I thought the veterans would be more presentable," replied her friend, adjusting her diamond bracelet. An older man with a glass of scotch sniffed dismissively. "Probably exaggerating his service. They all do." A younger couple exchanged uncomfortable glances. "Should we say something?" the woman whispered. "I feel awful." "Not our problem," her partner replied, tugging her toward the bar. "Let's get another drink." From his position near the wall, Matteo watched the reactions with growing disgust. These people had paid thousands for tickets to honor history while dismissing its living embodiment. They had applauded politely at rehearsed speeches about sacrifice, while turning away the man who had actually sacrificed. Connor remained frozen behind his desk, his tablet still displaying the guest list that hadn't included Elijah's name among the VIPs. His eyes darted nervously between the general and his supervisor across the room. General Hayes hadn't moved. He stood firm beside Elijah, one hand resting lightly on the older man's shoulder, his posture radiating a warning that no one dared challenge. The museum director finally approached, her high heels clicking frantically against the marble. She wore an expression that fluctuated between professional smile and panic. "General Hayes," she said breathlessly, "we're so honored you could join us. I see you've already met our—" She faltered, glancing uncertainly at Elijah. "Your guest of honor," Hayes finished for her, his tone brooking no argument. "Sergeant Major Monroe was just explaining to me how he was initially welcomed." The director's smile slipped further. "There appears to have been some miscommunication with our check-in procedures. I can assure you it wasn't a miscommunication," Matteo said, stepping forward. "He was turned away because of how he looked." The room fell silent again. Even the quartet had stopped playing. In that frozen moment, Elijah Monroe stood taller than he had in years, his worn coat suddenly seeming like the most dignified garment in the room. General Hayes stepped forward, his voice now directed at the museum director. "I think we should proceed with the evening's program, don't you? With one amendment, Sergeant Major Monroe will join me at the podium." The director nodded quickly, relief washing over her face at having someone take command of the increasingly awkward situation. She gestured toward the small stage where a podium stood illuminated by subtle spotlights. As they walked through the parting crowd, Elijah felt the weight of the small notebook in his pocket pressing against his ribs with each step. The leather cover was worn smooth from decades of handling, its pages yellowed and curling at the edges. He had never intended to show it to anyone. It wasn't meant for display, not like the artifacts under glass that people could admire without. Feeling their weight, at the podium, General Hayes spoke about valor, about sacrifice, about the bond between soldiers that civilians could never fully comprehend. His words were eloquent, practiced, the kind that belonged in marble halls like this. The audience nodded appreciatively, champagne glasses held at respectful angles, faces composed into expressions of solemn understanding. Then Hayes turned to Elijah. "I believe Sergeant Major Monroe has something more authentic to share than any speech I could give." Elijah hesitated. Public speaking had never been his strength. He had led men through gunfire and monsoons, but had always done so with actions rather than words. Still, he stepped forward, his fingers brushing against the notebook in his pocket. Meanwhile, men with a fraction of his courage walk around with chests full of ribbons. Elijah pushed himself to his feet. "We should go back out there. Get your speech done so these people can go home feeling good about themselves." "That's not what's going to happen," Hayes replied, the ghost of a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Not anymore." They emerged into the main gallery where the crowd had begun to stir restlessly. The director was speaking in hushed, urgent tones with a small cluster of board members near the podium. Connor had stationed himself as far from them as possible, busying himself with rearranging place cards at a display table. Hayes surveyed the room with the practiced eye of a tactician. Mateo caught the subtle nod he gave to his aides, positioned strategically near the exits. Whatever was about to happen had been planned long before tonight. "You orchestrated this," Elijah murmured, also noticing the positioning. "You knew they'd try to turn me away." "I suspected," Hayes admitted. "I've attended enough of these functions to know how they work, how they decide who belongs and who doesn't. So this was what? A test? A reckoning," Hayes corrected, "for all of us." Before Elijah could respond, a commotion near the main entrance drew everyone's attention. The massive doors swung open, and a formation of Marines in dress blues marched in with ceremonial precision, coming to a halt in perfect unison near the center of the room. Behind them, a line of men in civilian attire entered, most elderly, some in wheelchairs, all bearing the unmistakable bearing of veterans. The museum fell silent again as the Marines formed an honor corridor. An older man with a cane stepped forward from the civilian group. "Martinez," Elijah whispered, recognition lighting his eyes. "Echo Company, 2nd Platoon," Hayes confirmed. "Along with everyone else we could find from your unit, those who survived anyway. You brought them here tonight. They brought themselves, once they heard you'd finally agreed to attend one of these things." Hayes smiled fully now. "Turns out I wasn't the only one who remembered who carried them home." Martinez approached slowly, his weathered face breaking into a grin as he reached Elijah. Without a word, he pulled him into an embrace that bridged 50 years of separation. In an instant, one by one, the other veterans moved forward, forming a circle around Elijah. No grand speeches, no formal introductions, just the quiet acknowledgement of men who had shared the unshareable. The gala attendees stood frozen, suddenly aware that they were witnessing something more authentic than any exhibit could capture. The Marines remained at attention, a living border between polite society and the brotherhood forged in fire. Hayes stepped to the podium, his voice cutting through the emotion-charged atmosphere. "Ladies and gentlemen, I promised you history tonight. Now I invite you to witness honor. Martinez's grip on Elijah's shoulder remained firm, as if afraid his old sergeant might disappear if he let go. Around them, the circle of veterans had tightened, each man taking turns to clasp Elijah's hand, murmur a few words, or simply nod in silent recognition. Some wept openly, others stood tall despite pain evident in their stance, pride temporarily overriding the protests of aging bodies. "Never thought I'd see you in a fancy place like this, Sarge," Martinez said, his voice gruff with emotion. "Never. Thought I'd be let in," Elijah replied with a wry smile. A shorter man with thick glasses stepped forward. "Still got that old coat, I see." "No, Wilson," Elijah said, recognition warming his voice. "You remember this thing?" "Remember it?" Wilson laughed. "You wrapped my leg in strips you tore from the lining when I caught that shrapnel outside Pleiku. Doctor said later it's probably what kept me from bleeding out." The gala attendees had begun to gather at a respectful distance, drawn by curiosity, yet held back by an instinctive understanding that they were witnessing something not meant for them. The Marines remained at attention, creating a boundary between the veterans' reunion and the watching crowd. Connor stood frozen near the wall, his earlier smugness replaced by visible discomfort. Beside him, Dr. Brennan watched with a historian's appreciation for the unplanned authenticity unfolding before him. "I tried to find you after," a man in a wheelchair was saying to Elijah. "Sent letters to the VA, but they came back. It's like you vanished." "That was the idea," Elijah admitted. "Didn't think there was much waiting for me back in the world." Hayes had moved away from the podium to stand beside Mateo, both watching as 50 years of separation dissolved in moments of recognition. "Why did he disappear?" Mateo asked quietly. "After everything he did?" Hayes considered the question. "Some men come home from war and need everyone to know what they've done. Others come home and need everyone to forget. Elijah was always the latter." "But he kept the names," Mateo said. "He remembered." "That's different," Hayes replied. "He didn't carry them for recognition. He carried them so they wouldn't be forgotten." On the other side of the gallery, the museum director was in urgent conversation with the board chairman, both casting nervous glances toward the impromptu reunion that had derailed their carefully planned event. The mayor checked his watch repeatedly. Suddenly the main doors swung open again, letting in a gust of rain-cooled air. A young Marine lieutenant entered, making his way directly to General Hayes. He saluted crisply, then leaned in to deliver a message too quietly for others to hear. Hayes nodded, then straightened. "Gentlemen," he called to the veterans, "I'm told there's been a small change of plans." The circle parted as Hayes approached Elijah. "It seems the rain has let up, and there's something outside you might want to see." Curiosity rippled through the room. The director moved forward quickly. "General, we haven't unveiled the main exhibit yet. The donors will want to see this," Hayes finished for her, his tone making it clear the matter wasn't open for discussion. The Marines reformed their line, creating a path toward the exit. With Hayes on one side and Martinez on the other, Elijah moved forward, the rest of his unit falling in behind them. The gala attendees, sensing something significant, followed at a discreet distance. Outside, the rain had indeed stopped, leaving the night air washed clean and cool. The museum steps glistened under the floodlights. At the bottom of the steps stood rows of people, hundreds of them, lining both sides of the street. Many held small American flags, others carried hand-lettered signs. "Thank you, Sergeant Major Monroe. Echo Company heroes never forgotten. Welcome home." Elijah stopped, his breath catching. "What is this?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "Word got out," Hayes said simply. "Veterans groups, military families, ordinary citizens, they've been gathering for the past hour." A soft rain began to fall again, but no one moved. The crowd below remained steadfast. An elderly woman stepped forward from the front row, making her way carefully up the steps until she stood before Elijah. "You don't know me," she said, her voice quavering slightly. "But you saved my husband at Khe Sanh, James Wilkins." The first name from Elijah's notebook, the first of the 12. "He died," Elijah said softly. "I couldn't bring him home." The woman took his weathered hand in both of hers. "But you brought his letters home. You told me how brave he was. You made sure I knew he didn't die alone." Tears mingled with raindrops on her face. "I never got to thank you." All around them, the rain continued to fall gently, beading on Elijah's coat like stars. Time seemed suspended as Elijah stood with Mrs. Wilkins' hands wrapped around his own. The rain fell softly around them, but neither moved to seek shelter. For a moment, they were the only two people on the steps, a widow and the man who had carried her husband's memory for half a century. Then she reached into her purse and withdrew a small, worn envelope. "He wrote this the day before he died. You're mentioned." She pressed it gently into Elijah's palm. "I thought you should have it." Elijah stared at the faded paper, unable to speak. Hayes stepped forward, shielding both of them from the rain with his broad shoulders. "Perhaps we should continue this inside," he suggested quietly. The crowd below remained in place, uncomplaining despite the weather. As Elijah turned to re-enter the museum, they began to applaud, a steady, respectful sound that followed him, up the steps and through the doors. Inside, the atmosphere had transformed. The earlier cocktail chatter and superficial pleasantries had been replaced by a solemn awareness that something authentic had entered their carefully curated space. The veterans of Echo Company formed a loose semicircle around Elijah, their presence creating an island of genuine experience in the sea of formal attire. Connor approached hesitantly, his earlier confidence nowhere to be seen. He stopped a respectful distance from Elijah, clearing his throat. "Sergeant Major Monroe," he began, his voice pitched low enough that only those nearby could hear, "I've been instructed to escort you to the VIP section for the remainder of the evening." Before Elijah could respond, Martinez stepped forward. "The Sarge doesn't need special treatment now. Where was this VIP invitation when he showed up in his coat?" Connor's face flushed. "There was a misunderstanding about what?" Wilson interrupted. "About what a hero looks like, about whether valor wears a tuxedo?" Elijah raised a hand, stilling his former comrades. "It's all right. What's done is done." Hayes watched the exchange with narrowed eyes, then moved to the center of the room. Without preamble, he raised his voice to address the entire gathering. "Ladies and gentlemen, I believe it's time we dispensed with the usual protocols. Tonight was meant to honor sacrifice and courage. Instead, it has revealed how easily we forget what those words truly mean." The room fell silent. Even the mayor stopped checking his watch. Sergeant Major Elijah Monroe declined the Medal of Honor. He refused commendations and recognition. He chose to carry the burden of memory privately, asking nothing in return for his service. Hayes turned to face Elijah directly. "But tonight, that changes." With deliberate movements, Hayes drew himself to his full height, squaring his shoulders. Then, with perfect military precision, he executed a formal salute, not the casual acknowledgement he had offered earlier at the door, but the slow, measured tribute of one warrior to another. He held the salute, unwavering. For 3 heartbeats, nothing happened. Then Martinez straightened beside Elijah and returned the salute. Wilson followed. One by one, every veteran in the room raised their hands in silent respect. The Marines by the door moved in perfect unison, their white gloves flashing in the light as they saluted. The sharp sound of their synchronized movement cut through the silence. Matteo, still in his security uniform, stepped forward and offered his own salute, inexpert but heartfelt. Dr. Brennan did the same. Then remarkably others began to join. A man in an expensive suit, a woman in an evening gown, the museum's board chairman. Even the mayor raised his hand in an awkward approximation of military respect. The room transformed into a forest of raised hands, a living tribute that acknowledged what the exhibits behind glass could only suggest. At the center of it all stood Elijah Monroe in his weathered coat, rain still glistening on his shoulders, the envelope from Mrs. Wilkins clutched in his trembling hand. For decades, he had walked through the world unrecognized, carrying the weight of war and memory without complaint. He had accepted being overlooked, being forgotten, being dismissed. He had asked for nothing and expected less. Now, surrounded by salutes from generals and civilians alike, something long buried rose in his chest. Slowly, with dignity that transcended his worn clothes and aging frame, Elijah Monroe returned the salute. The gesture contained everything. Words could not express, acknowledgement of sacrifice shared, of burdens carried, of nights when sleep would not come because the dead still spoke too loudly. No one moved, no glass clinked, no camera flashed. It was, perhaps, the first moment of genuine reverence the museum had ever witnessed. The formal program of the evening had been quietly abandoned. There would be no speeches about generous donors, no recognition of board members who had never seen combat. Instead, the museum had transformed into something it was always meant to be but rarely achieved, a place where history breathed and moved among the living. Dr. Brennan, sensing the shift, had instructed the staff to remove the velvet ropes that separated the exhibits from the guests. "Tonight there are no barriers," he announced. "Tonight we learn from those who lived it." Elijah moved slowly through the gallery, flanked by his former unit members, stopping before displays that captured fragments of their shared past. At each station, the rehearsed narratives on plaques gave way to first-hand accounts. "That wasn't how it happened," Wilson said, pointing to a diorama depicting a battlefield maneuver. "The terrain was much steeper. We couldn't see more than 10 feet ahead in that fog." Martinez nodded. "And we were out of radio contact for 6 hours, not 2. Dr. Brennan followed with a small notebook, hastily recording corrections and insights that decades of academic research had missed. The gala attendees trailed behind at a respectful distance, their earlier disinterest replaced by genuine curiosity. A woman in a designer dress approached Elijah tentatively. "May I ask you something?" When he nodded, she continued, "My father served in Vietnam, but he never spoke about it. Not once. I've always wondered why." Elijah considered her question carefully. "Some experiences don't translate into words," he said finally, "and some words, once spoken, can't be unheard. Maybe he was protecting you both." The crowd around them had grown, other guests drawing closer to hear his response. "Did you ever tell anyone?" another voice asked. "About what happened over there?" "No," Elijah replied simply, "until tonight." They reached a glass case containing a collection of field maps, including the one Elijah had drawn on the back of a ration box. He paused, studying it with a slight frown. "Something wrong, Sarge?" Martinez asked. "They've got it oriented incorrectly," Elijah said, gesturing to the display. "North should be here." He pointed to what was labeled as East. Dr. Brennan immediately produced a key and opened the case. "Would you mind showing us?" With careful hands, Elijah reached in and rotated the map. "We were moving uphill, see? This ridge provided cover, but there was a clearing here that left us exposed." His finger traced lines on the worn paper, bringing to life what had been, moments before, merely a museum piece. "I lost Sanders there," he added quietly, naming one of the 12 from his notebook. Martinez placed a hand on his shoulder, the simple gesture communicating volumes. Connor, who had been hovering at the edges of the group, stepped forward unexpectedly. His earlier arrogance had been replaced by something like wonder. "Did you really draw that in the field?" he asked. "Under fire?" Elijah looked at him, seeing not the pompous gatekeeper from earlier, but a young man confronting realities beyond his experience. "Yes," he answered. "When the regular maps proved inaccurate, we had to create our own. Lives depended on it." "I don't understand," Connor admitted, his voice softer now. "How could you focus on something like map-making with bullets flying around you?" The question hung in the air, inviting easy dismissal. Instead, Elijah considered it seriously. "Fear narrows your vision," he explained, "but responsibility widens it again. I had men looking to me for direction. Their trust mattered more than my terror." The simple wisdom in his words silenced the group. Here was a lesson no exhibit could convey. They continued through the gallery, the planned tour route abandoned in favor of following Elijah's memories. At each display, history was rewritten, not in grand, sweeping revisions, but in small human corrections. The exact color of jungle, foliage after rainfall, the weight of a standard-issue pack when soaked with monsoon water, the distinct sound of distant artillery that veterans could still identify by caliber decades later. What had begun as a sterile commemoration had become a living testimony. Glass cases that had held artifacts now framed reflections of the men who had once carried them. Photographs that had been captioned by researchers were now explained by their subjects. Matteo, walking beside Dr. Brennan, observed it all with growing understanding. "This," he said quietly, "is what the museum should have been all along." Brennan nodded. "History isn't dead. It walks among us, if only we have the wisdom to recognize it." The centerpiece of the Vietnam exhibit stood in a specially designed case illuminated by subtle lighting, the Southern Ridge map, drawn by Elijah on the back of a C-ration box during the height of the monsoon season in 1968. The paper had yellowed with age, the creases deep from being folded and unfolded countless times in humid jungle conditions. The pencil lines, remarkably precise given the circumstances of their creation, showed elevation changes, water crossings, and danger zones with a clarity that had saved dozens of lives. As the group approached, Dr. Brennan stepped forward to provide context. "This map is perhaps our most significant artifact. When official intelligence proved faulty, Sergeant Major Monroe created this from memory and first-hand reconnaissance. It guided 3 separate platoons safely through hostile territory during Operation Firestorm." Elijah stood silently before the display, seeing not the carefully preserved artifact, but the moment of its creation. His hands shaking with exhaustion, rain seeping through the makeshift tent, the distant sound of artillery making the air vibrate. He had drawn it by flashlight, careful to keep the beam shielded, lest it attract enemy fire. "You're looking at it wrong," he said suddenly. The group fell silent. "The map itself isn't what mattered," he continued. "It was the men who used it, the ones who trusted it enough to follow where it led." Hayes nodded, understanding. "Leadership isn't about having all the answers. It's about being willing to find them when others can't." A woman near the front of the group, one of the museum's regular docents, raised her hand tentatively. "The catalogue notes that you created 17 field maps during your service. Were they all drawn in similar conditions?" Elijah shook his head. "Some were worse, some better. That one," he gestured to a smaller map in an adjacent case, "I drew while we were pinned down in a rice paddy, water up to our chests for 6 hours." Wilson stepped closer to the display. "I remember that day. You kept the paper dry by holding it above your head with one hand and drawing with the other. How accurate were these improvised maps compared to the official ones? Connor asked, his earlier dismissiveness replaced by genuine curiosity. Martinez answered before Elijah could. The official maps showed what someone in an office thought should be there. Sarge's maps showed what was actually there. Men who followed the official maps sometimes didn't come back. The simple truth of this statement hung in the air. Dr. Brennan made another note in his book, understanding that the museum's carefully worded placards would need significant revision. An elderly man in an expensive suit pushed his way forward, introducing himself as a member of the museum's board. I have a question about the tactical significance of... Dad, a younger woman beside him interrupted gently. Let's just listen. Elijah gave her a grateful nod, then turned back to the map display. With careful movements, he traced the outline of a winding river depicted on the faded paper. We lost Collins here, he said quietly, his finger hovering over a bend in the waterway. Current was stronger than it looked. We had to leave his body. His voice caught slightly. That's not in your exhibit. A hush fell over the group. Every line on this map has a story behind it, Elijah continued after a moment. Every hill, every clearing, every stream. Not just military positions and tactical advantages, but moments when men were tested, when they lived or died, when they showed courage or fear, or both at once. He looked up at the gathered crowd, his eyes clear and direct. Maps tell you where things are, but they can't tell you what happened there. A young woman with a press badge who had been quietly taking notes spoke up. Would you be willing to share some of those stories, the ones behind the lines? For a moment, Elijah seemed ready to refuse. Then he glanced at Hayes, at Martinez, at the faces of his unit members, now elderly men, but forever young in his memory. He saw in their expressions permission, even encouragement. Yes, he said finally, I think it's time. Dr. Brennan stepped forward, his historian's instincts awakened by the prospect of first-hand testimony. We could record your recollections, create an oral history to accompany the exhibit. Elijah shook his head slightly. Not recordings. Not yet. He gestured to the surrounding space with its glass cases and carefully mounted displays. First, let's walk the map together. Let me show you what's missing. As they moved to the next exhibit, the crowd following respectfully behind, Mateo whispered to Hayes, he's creating a new kind of map now, isn't he? One made of memories instead of terrain. Hayes nodded. And like all his maps, this one will lead us somewhere true. They stopped before a glass case containing military identification tags, dog tags, arranged in a solemn cascade against black velvet. The display plaque read, In Memory, the Fallen of Echo Company, with a precise body count below. The sterile presentation made death into a statistic, history sanitized for public consumption. Elijah stood motionless before it, his reflection ghosted over the metal tags that had once hung against beating hearts. The gathered crowd waited in respectful silence, sensing they were witnessing something beyond their understanding. Raymond Diaz, Elijah said finally, pointing to a tag near the top of the display. 20 years old, played guitar, terrible at it, but we listened anyway because it reminded us of home. His finger moved to another. Peter Kozlowski. We called him Koz. Always carried hard candies in his pocket to give to local children. One by one he named them, adding details no historical record had preserved, not their rank or hometown or military accomplishments, but the small human particularities that had made them individuals rather than casualties. Michael Chen had the worst poker face you ever saw, lost every hand but never stopped playing. Frank Delgado, kept a picture of his baby daughter in his helmet, never got to meet her. Names became people, statistics became stories. The sterile display transformed into a memorial. Hayes stood slightly behind Elijah, his own memories clearly visible in the tightening of his jaw. "We talk about paying the price of freedom," he said quietly to those gathered around. "But the invoice never comes to us. It goes to men like these." A well-dressed man near the front of the group cleared his throat. "I donate to veterans' causes every year," he offered, as if seeking affirmation. Elijah didn't look at him. "That's good," he said simply, "but money doesn't balance this kind of ledger." The man fell silent, perhaps understanding for the first time the inadequacy of his charity against the sacrifice being commemorated. Wilson stepped forward to stand beside Elijah. "Tell them about Hansen," he suggested gently. Elijah hesitated, then nodded. "David Hansen isn't in this display because his body was never recovered. He stepped on a mine while taking point on a patrol I ordered." The words came slowly, each one weighted with decades of carried guilt. "I heard him calling for his mother as we tried to reach him. The area was too hot, enemy fire keeping us pinned down. By the time we fought our way to his position, he was gone." The museum fell completely silent. No one shifted position or checked their watch or whispered to their companion. "His tag should be here," Elijah continued, "but it's probably still out there, somewhere in the jungle mixed with the soil." Dr. Brennan made a note, his historian's objectivity temporarily abandoned as he wiped discreetly at his eyes. "We'll correct the display," he promised. Elijah nodded, then turned to address the gathered crowd directly. "You come to places like this to honor sacrifice. That's good. It should be honored. But don't confuse viewing these displays with understanding what they represent." His gaze swept across the assembled faces, the wealthy donors, the politicians, the civilians who had never served. "Freedom isn't free," is something people say when they haven't calculated the actual cost. When they haven't carried the bodies, or written the letters home, or woken up screaming decades later. No one spoke. No one moved. "The real cost isn't measured in dollars or medals or memorial statues," Elijah continued, his voice steady despite the emotion behind it. "It's measured in empty chairs at family tables, in fatherless children, in wives who become widows while still in their 20s, in mothers who outlive their sons." He gestured toward the dog tags. "Each of these represents a universe of possibility that was extinguished. Dreams, futures, loves, children who were never born, books that were never written, lives that ended so that others could continue." Martinez placed a hand on Elijah's shoulder, offering silent support. The act seemed to recall Elijah to the present moment, and he straightened slightly. "I don't say this to make you feel guilty for being here in your fine clothes enjoying peace," he clarified. "I say it so you understand what you're looking at behind this glass. Not artifacts, not history, not statistics." His voice dropped to almost a whisper, but in the silence, everyone heard him. "Sacred things." As the group moved toward the next exhibit, Connor appeared at Elijah's elbow, his earlier arrogance replaced by something that resembled genuine contrition. "Sergeant Major," he said, his voice low enough that only those standing closest could hear, "I need to apologize properly. What I did earlier was inexcusable." Elijah studied the young man's face, seeing beyond the expensive haircut and practiced smile to the uncertainty beneath. For a moment, he said nothing, simply letting the weight of his gaze rest on Connor. "Why did you do it?" he asked finally. Connor blinked, clearly having expected either quick forgiveness or outright dismissal, not this direct question that required honest self-examination. He hesitated. "It's my job to maintain standards for events like this." "That's Not an answer, Elijah replied. That's a deflection. Why did you look at me and decide I didn't belong? The surrounding conversations quieted as people became aware of the exchange. Connor glanced around, uncomfortable with the sudden audience, but Elijah's steady gaze kept him rooted in place. I judged you by your appearance, Connor admitted finally. I saw the coat and made assumptions. About my worth, Elijah stated. Connor nodded, a flush creeping up his neck. Yes. General Hayes had drifted closer, listening with interest but not interrupting. Behind him, several board members and the museum director hovered, clearly concerned about the direction of the conversation. The thing about character, Elijah said, his voice gaining strength, is that it doesn't announce itself with fancy clothes or important titles. It reveals itself in moments of pressure, when doing the right thing costs you something. He glanced around at the assembled crowd, most still in their finery, despite the evening's disruption to the formal program. In Vietnam, I learned quickly that you couldn't judge a man by his appearance. Some of the most decorated officers were cowards when bullets started flying. Some of the scrawniest, most unimpressive-looking recruits turned out to be lions when their brothers needed them. Connor stood very still, absorbing the words. You're not the first to make that mistake, Elijah continued. Won't be the last. The question is whether you learn from it. I want to, Connor said, and for the first time that evening, there was no artifice in his voice. The museum director stepped forward then, perhaps sensing an opportunity for institutional damage control. We all want to learn from this regrettable incident, she offered smoothly. Perhaps we could establish a new scholarship program for veterans or a special exhibition. That's not the point, Hayes interrupted, his tone firm but not unkind. This isn't about creating a new program or exhibition. It's about recognizing the humanity in front of you before it needs to be labeled and explained. Matteo, who had been standing quietly nearby, spoke up. It's about seeing people, not categories. Elijah nodded in agreement. Exactly. Connor seemed to be genuinely processing these words. He straightened slightly, meeting Elijah's gaze directly. I was wrong, he said simply, not because of who you turned out to be, but because of how I behaved toward a fellow human being. I'm sorry. A small smile touched the corners of Elijah's mouth, the first genuine one he had offered all evening. That's a start. The group began to move forward again, but Elijah placed a hand on Connor's arm, holding him back momentarily. One more thing, he said quietly. That coat you dismissed? It's kept me warm through worse nights than this. It's been a pillow for dying men and a bandage for wounded ones. It's soaked up rain and blood and tears. He ran his fingers over the worn sleeve, the gesture almost tender. Things, like people, aren't always what they seem at first glance. The value isn't always visible on the surface. Connor nodded slowly, understanding dawning in his eyes. I won't forget. Good, Elijah replied, because in the end, we're all just passing through. The medals, the titles, the fancy clothes, they all fall away. What remains is how we treated each other in the moments that mattered. As they rejoined the main group, Hayes fell into step beside Elijah. You could have destroyed that young man, he observed quietly. You had every right to. Elijah shook his head. What would that accomplish? More division, more bitterness. He glanced back at Connor, now listening attentively to Martinez explain a display. Besides, destroying is easy, building is harder. Always the sergeant, Hayes said with a small smile, still teaching, still leading. Some habits, Elijah replied, you never unlearn. Word of what was happening inside the museum had spread. As the impromptu tour continued, more people arrived, Not the expected wealthy donors in evening wear, but ordinary citizens in everyday clothes. Veterans wearing caps embroidered with unit insignias. Families with children old enough to understand the significance of the moment. College students from the nearby university's history department. The museum staff, initially flustered by the unscheduled influx, had stopped checking invitations altogether. The velvet ropes that had once separated the VIP section from general. Admission areas were removed, creating a single unified space where rank and status had become irrelevant. Dr. Brennan surveyed the scene with quiet satisfaction. "This is how it should always be," he murmured to Matteo. "History doesn't belong behind glass. It belongs to everyone." As the group approached the final wing of the exhibit, a subtle shift occurred. The veterans of Echo Company, who had been following Elijah's lead, now moved to surround him, forming an informal honor guard. Hayes took position at Elijah's right shoulder, Martinez at his left. The crowd, sensing the significance of this formation, parted naturally to create a path. Through the center of the gallery, conversations hushed. Those seated on benches rose to their feet. Elijah walked forward slowly, his bearing erect despite the long evening and the ache in his knee. His coat, still damp from the rain earlier, hung from his shoulders like a mantle. No longer a symbol of poverty or disregard, but a badge of honor, more authentic than any medal or ribbon. As they passed, people stepped back respectfully. Some nodded, others placed their hands over their hearts. A group of younger Marines, who had arrived in their dress blues, snapped to attention and saluted. Connor, watching from near the wall, leaned toward Dr. Brennan. "I've never seen anything like this," he whispered. "It's not on the program. No one organized it. It's just happening." "That's because it's real," Brennan replied. "Not choreographed or rehearsed, just genuine human recognition." A woman stepped forward from the crowd, her hand extended. "My son is deployed overseas right now," she said to Elijah. "May I shake your hand to thank you for your service?" Elijah stopped, taking her hand in his weathered one. "No," he said gently. "Let me shake yours to thank you for your sacrifice. Mothers who send their children to war deserve as much recognition as those who fight." The woman's eyes filled with tears as she stepped back, making way for others who now approached with similar requests. A young boy asked for a high five. An elderly man in a wheelchair reached up to clasp Elijah's hand without speaking, the simple gesture communicating across the decades. What had begun as a formal museum gala had transformed into something more akin to a pilgrimage, with people drawn not to the artifacts, but to the living embodiment of the history they represented. Through it all, Elijah maintained a quiet dignity. He addressed each person who approached him with the same respectful attention, regardless of age or appearance. Where earlier in the evening he had been invisible, now he was seen, truly seen, perhaps for the first time in decades. The museum director, watching from the sidelines with a mixture of awe and professional concern, turned to the board chairman. "This wasn't the evening we planned," she said quietly. "No," the chairman agreed. "It's the evening we needed." As the impromptu procession reached the center of the final gallery, Hayes raised a hand, signaling for them to pause. The crowd grew still, anticipation building. "Before we continue," he announced, his voice carrying without effort, "I want to acknowledge what we're witnessing here tonight. When Sergeant Major Monroe arrived at this museum, he was judged unworthy of entry based on his appearance. Now, he walks among us as a living testament to the values this institution claims to honor." He turned to Elijah, genuine emotion visible on his face. "You never sought recognition, never asked for gratitude, never expected anything in return for your sacrifice. But tonight, we see you, all of you, not just the uniform you once wore, but the man you've always been." A murmur of agreement passed through the assembled crowd. "Now," Hayes continued, gesturing toward the final exhibit room, Shall we proceed to the place of honor?" Elijah nodded, and once again the crowd parted before him like water, creating a path toward his own legacy. Dawn broke over the city, painting the skyline in soft gold and rose. Elijah sat at his small kitchen table, a mug of black coffee cooling between his weathered hands. His morning routine remained unchanged. Oatmeal with brown sugar, medications arranged in their plastic organizer, the quiet ticking of the wall clock marking time as it always had. What had changed was the newspaper spread before him, still crisp with the scent of fresh ink. General Holt's gala after war. Hero denied entry. Veteran humiliated, then honored before silent crowd. Below the headline was a photograph. Elijah standing in his rain-soaked coat as General Hayes saluted him on the museum steps. The image captured the dignity in his stance, the quiet strength that no formal attire could have conveyed more eloquently. The article continued inside, spanning 2 full pages. There were more photographs. Elijah with his former unit members, Elijah pointing to his hand-drawn maps, Elijah walking through the parted crowd. And most striking, Connor Winthrop shaking his hand, both men's expressions revealing the completion of a journey from judgment to understanding. Elijah's phone had been ringing since 6 a.m., old friends who recognized him in the paper, veterans organizations offering honorary memberships, 3 different news channels requesting interviews. He had answered none of them, letting the calls go to his rarely used voicemail. A knock at his door broke the morning quiet. Through the peephole, he saw Matteo standing in the hallway, still in his security uniform from an overnight shift, a newspaper tucked under his arm. "I hope it's not too early," Matteo said when Elijah opened the door. "I just finished my shift and wanted to see how you were doing after everything last night." Elijah gestured for him to enter. "Coffee? That would be great, thank you." As Elijah poured a second mug, Matteo glanced at the newspaper on the table. "So you've seen it. Hard to miss. You're famous now." Matteo accepted the coffee, with a grateful nod. "Infamous, maybe." Elijah's tone was dry, but a slight smile softened his face. "Not sure I'm cut out for public attention." They sat in companionable silence for a moment, sipping their coffee. Through the apartment window, city traffic hummed, the world continuing its ordinary rhythm despite the extraordinary events of the previous night. "My phone's been ringing all morning," Elijah said finally. "Reporters, talk shows, someone from a publishing company asking about memoir rights. Are you going to talk to them?" Elijah considered the question. "Not sure what I'd say. Last night wasn't about me. It was about remembering the men who never came home, about correcting the way history gets sanitized and simplified." "But your story is part of that history," Matteo pointed out gently. "The way you were treated last night, both the rejection and the recognition, says something important about how we view veterans, how we decide who deserves respect based on appearances." The wisdom in the young man's observation wasn't lost on Elijah. He studied Matteo with newfound appreciation. "Your grandfather would be proud of you." Matteo's eyes brightened at the mention of his abuelo. "I have something to tell you about." "That? I called my grandmother this morning after my shift, told her everything that happened." He leaned forward eagerly. "Turns out my grandfather knew who you were all along. He kept a newspaper clipping about you saving those men in '68, had it in the same box with his service medals." Elijah's expression softened. "Small world. She wants to meet you. Says she has letters my grandfather wrote home that mention you." Before Elijah could respond, his phone rang again. The caller ID showed Crystal Grove War Museum. "You should answer that one," Matteo suggested. Elijah hesitated, then reached for the phone. Dr. Brennan's voice came through, apologetic yet excited. "Sergeant Major Monroe, I hope I'm not calling too early. I wanted to let you know that the board held an emergency meeting this morning. In light of last night's events, we've made some decisions I think you should hear about. As Brennan outlined the museum's plans, a complete redesign of the Vietnam exhibit with veterans as consultants, an educational program bringing soldiers into classrooms, a special display featuring Elijah's coat with the full story of its significance. Elijah's expression remained thoughtful. When he hung up, Mateo raised an eyebrow in question. "They want to put my coat in the museum," Elijah said, "as part of a permanent exhibit about looking beyond appearances and recognizing true service. Will you do it?" Elijah glanced at the newspaper headline once more, then out the window where the morning sun now illuminated the city in earnest. "Maybe," he said. "But first, I think I have some stories to tell." The week passed in a blur of unexpected activity. Elijah's small apartment had seen more visitors in 7 days than in the previous 7 years. General Hayes had stopped by twice, bringing coffee and conversation that drifted easily between past and present. Martinez and Wilson had driven in from neighboring states, bringing old photographs and older stories that filled the modest living room with laughter and occasional tears. Most surprising was Connor Winthrop's visit on Thursday afternoon, arriving with nervous formality and leaving 3 hours later with a handshake that contained genuine respect. He had listened more than he spoke, taking notes for the museum's revised exhibit labels with meticulous attention to Elijah's corrections and additions. Now, early Saturday morning, another knock sounded at Elijah's door. When he opened it, Mateo stood in the hallway, not in his security uniform, but in a crisp button-down shirt and slacks. His expression held an odd mixture of solemnity and suppressed excitement. "Good morning, sir," he said with formal politeness that wasn't his usual manner. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." "Not at all," Elijah replied, gesturing him inside. "Coffee's fresh." "I can't stay long," Mateo said, remaining in the doorway. "I'm actually here on official business." He straightened slightly. "The museum would like to invite you to a private ceremony this afternoon, just a small gathering before they reopen the revised exhibit to the public on Monday." Elijah raised an eyebrow. "What kind of ceremony?" "Dr. Brennan didn't share all the details. He just asked me to personally escort you if you're willing to come." Mateo hesitated, then added, "I think it would mean a lot to everyone involved." Something in the young man's tone made Elijah study him more carefully. "There's more to this than you're saying." Mateo's attempt at a poker face crumbled under Elijah's direct gaze. "It's supposed to be a surprise," he admitted. "But yes, there's more to it. Something important." Elijah considered for a moment, then nodded. "What time should I be ready?" 2 o'clock and—" Mateo hesitated again. "Dr. Brennan mentioned that your coat should come too." At precisely 2, a sleek black car pulled up in front of Elijah's apartment building. Mateo held the door as Elijah settled into the back seat, his brown wool coat freshly brushed but still bearing the subtle marks of its long history. The barely visible shrapnel scar near the left pocket, the slightly darkened area on the right. Sleeve where a field dressing had once been hastily pressed. The museum was closed to the public, but several cars were parked near the staff entrance. Mateo led Elijah through a side door and down a quiet corridor to a room marked Conservation Laboratory. Inside, a small group waited: Dr. Brennan, General Hayes, the museum director, and Connor, who now wore a name badge identifying him as Connor Winthrop, Community Outreach Coordinator. "Thank you for coming, Sergeant Major," Dr. Brennan said, warmly. "We have something we'd like to show you before the others arrive." He gestured toward a workbench where a conservation specialist was making final adjustments to something Elijah couldn't quite see. As he approached, she stepped aside with a respectful nod, revealing a brass plaque mounted on polished wood. Elijah leaned closer to read the inscription, "To Sergeant Major Elijah Monroe, the mapmaker, the mentor, the memory." He paused, his breath catching slightly before reading the rest. This coat carried the weight of war, the dignity of service, and the silence of a forgotten hero. Let it remind us that honor doesn't always shine. Sometimes it simply endures. The words blurred slightly as Elijah straightened, blinking rapidly. "We'd like your permission to display your coat alongside this plaque," Dr. Brennan said quietly, "as the centerpiece of our redesigned Vietnam exhibit." "The wording is only a proposal," the director added quickly. "We can change anything you feel isn't appropriate." Elijah shook his head slowly. "The words are fine," he said, his voice rougher than usual. "But the coat isn't ready for a museum yet. I understand if you're not comfortable with—" "Doctor," Brennan began. "That's not what I meant," Elijah interrupted gently. He ran his hand along the worn sleeve. "This coat still has work to do, stories to tell, children to meet." He looked up, meeting each person's gaze in turn. "I appreciate the honor, truly, but I think the coat and I should stay together a while longer." Hayes smiled slightly, nodding as if he'd expected this answer. "What do you propose instead?" Elijah considered for a moment. "Keep the plaque. Use it to introduce the new exhibit. But instead of my coat behind glass, I'd like to be there myself. Once a week, maybe, to talk with visitors, answer questions, make sure the stories stay alive." The conservation specialist, who had been quietly observing, spoke up unexpectedly. "Like a living exhibit. Like a bridge," Elijah corrected, "between what was and what is." Dr. Brennan's face lit up. "Even better than what we'd planned." Connor stepped forward, offering his hand to Elijah. "I think I speak for everyone when I say we'd be honored." As they shook hands, Matteo moved to open the door, revealing the main gallery beyond, where other veterans and guests had begun to gather. The brass plaque caught the light, gleaming like a promise. 6 months passed. Autumn gave way to winter, winter to spring. Every Wednesday afternoon, Elijah Monroe sat in the Vietnam exhibit at the Crystal Grove War Museum, his presence transforming the sterile display into something alive and breathing. Children would approach hesitantly at first, then grow bold with questions. Veterans would sit silently beside him, the unspoken understanding between them deeper than any exhibit could capture. Ordinary visitors would leave with damp eyes and straightened shoulders, having encountered history not as an abstract concept, but as a living presence. The museum had never seen such attendance figures. What began as a weekly appearance expanded to include special events and educational programs. Elijah found himself speaking at schools, recording oral histories with university archivists, consulting with documentarians. His quiet life had become unexpectedly public, his long-carried memories now shared rather than silently shouldered. Through it all, he wore the brown wool coat. It became his signature, as recognizable to museum regulars as the building itself. Children would point and whisper when they saw him walking downtown. "There's the coat man," they'd say with reverence, untainted by pity or condescension. On a bright June morning, Elijah arrived at the museum to find unusual activity at the staff entrance. Equipment was being unloaded, technicians in white gloves moving carefully with specialized tools. Matteo, now promoted to security supervisor, greeted him with barely contained excitement. "They're ready for the installation," he explained, leading Elijah through the back corridors. "Dr. Brennan wanted you to be the first to see it." "Installation of what?" Elijah asked, though something in his tone suggested he already knew. They entered the Vietnam Gallery to find Dr. Brennan directing the placement of a new display case. Unlike the other exhibits with their formal, impersonal design, this one had been created to resemble a simple wooden stand like those found in ordinary homes. Behind the conservation glass stood a mannequin shaped not with the rigid posture of a soldier at attention, but with the slightly stooped shoulders of a man who had carried weight for a long time. On the mannequin hung a brown wool coat. Elijah stopped, momentarily confused. He glanced down at the coat he was wearing, then back at the identical one in the display. Dr. Brennan approached with a smile. "Martinez found it," he explained. "Apparently the military issued 2 of these to each soldier in your unit. He kept his all these years, barely worn. When he heard about your weekly talks, he donated it to create this exhibit." Elijah moved closer to the display, studying the coat behind glass. It was remarkably similar to his own, same style, same material, but this one was pristine, unmarked by time or experience. Beside it, the brass plaque they had shown him months ago had been mounted at eye level. "We thought you might need yours a while longer," Dr. Brennan continued. "But we also wanted visitors to see what it represents, even when you're not here." A small brass plate mounted on the display stand caught Elijah's attention. It read simply, "The coat Sergeant Major Monroe wears has seen the worst of humanity and carried the best of it. This represents what he's looked like before the journey began." Elijah stood quietly, absorbing the subtle meaning of the exhibit. It wasn't just about a coat, but about transformation, about how experience marks us, changes us, becomes part of our visible history. "Do you approve?" Dr. Brennan asked, suddenly concerned by Elijah's silence. Elijah nodded slowly. "It's right," he said finally. "One coat preserved as it was, one coat continuing the journey." Later that afternoon, Elijah sat in his usual spot in the gallery. Around him, visitors moved from display to display, now pausing longer at each one, reading the revised placards that included personal details alongside historical facts. A boy of about 10 approached, his eyes moving between Elijah and the new exhibit with its pristine coat. "Is that what your coat looked like before the war?" he asked. "Yes," Elijah replied. The boy studied both coats carefully. "I like yours better," he said decisively. "It tells more stories." Elijah smiled. "That's because it's lived more life. When I grow up, I want a coat with stories too," the boy declared. "I hope they're happier stories than some of mine," Elijah said gently. The boy considered this. "My dad says some stories are sad because important things are worth hurting for." He looked at Elijah with earnest eyes. "Were the important things worth it?" Elijah glanced at the display case with its unworn coat, then at the brass plaque that captured in words what he had carried in silence for so long. Around them, the museum hummed with visitors learning, remembering, connecting. "Yes," he said. Finally, the important things were worth it. As the boy moved on to the next display, Elijah ran his hand along his sleeve, feeling the texture of a garment that had become more than clothing. It had become a testament. One coat preserved. Behind glass, pristine and untouched, one coat continuing its work in the world, worn and weathered but very much alive, just like memory itself. 1 year to the day after Elijah Monroe had stood in the rain outside the Crystal Grove War Museum, he sat in his apartment preparing for another Wednesday afternoon session. His routine had expanded but remained methodical. Medications, coffee, oatmeal, and now a small notebook where he jotted down stories visitors had asked him to share. The knock at his door came precisely at noon. Mateo had been driving him to the museum each week, their car rides filled with conversations that spanned generations. Today, however, when Elijah opened the door, he found not just Mateo, but General Hayes as well. "Hope you don't mind the company," Hayes said. his formal military bearing softened by the genuine warmth in his eyes. "Thought I'd join you today. Special occasion?" Elijah asked, reaching for his coat. "You could say that," Matteo replied with a barely contained smile. The drive to the museum was filled with comfortable silence, punctuated by occasional observations about the changing season. Spring had fully arrived, the city parks vibrant with new growth, the air carrying the promise of renewal. As they approached the museum, Elijah noticed something unusual. The parking lot was filled beyond capacity, cars lining the street in both directions. A crowd had gathered near the entrance, many in military uniforms, others in civilian clothes, holding small American flags. "What's happening?" he asked, a note of concern in his voice. Hayes placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Anniversary," he said simply. "1 year since the night everything changed. Day." As Matteo parked the car, Elijah could see more clearly now, faces he recognized from his Wednesday talks, veterans who had shared their own stories after hearing his, children who had sat cross-legged on the floor asking questions about the maps and photos and always about the coat. "I didn't expect this," he said quietly. "That's been the story of your life, hasn't it?" Hayes replied. "Never expecting recognition, never seeking it." They exited the car, moving toward the entrance where Dr. Brennan waited with Connor beside him. The crowd parted naturally, creating a path just as they had done a year before. This time, however, there was no awkwardness, no judgment, only genuine respect flowing from hundreds of faces that now knew not just the historical facts of war, but the human stories Elijah had shared. "Sergeant Major," Dr. Brennan greeted him warmly, extending his hand. "Thank you for coming today. We have something to show you." Inside, the museum had been transformed. What had once been simply the Vietnam exhibit now bore a new name emblazoned. Above the entrance, enduring honor, the Elijah Monroe Gallery. Elijah stopped, momentarily overwhelmed. "You didn't need to do this," he said. "We didn't do it for you," Connor replied, the arrogant young man of a year ago now replaced by someone more thoughtful, more genuine. "We did it for everyone who will come here in the future, so they'll understand that history isn't just about facts and dates, it's about people." The gallery had evolved over the months of Elijah's visits. Where once there had been only artifacts behind glass, now there were interactive stations where visitors could listen to veterans' oral histories. The maps Elijah had drawn were displayed alongside photographs of the terrain as it looked today. The pristine coat in its display case stood opposite a life-sized photograph of Elijah in his weathered one, creating a before and after narrative more powerful than any written explanation. And at the center of it all, a new installation had been added overnight, a simple wooden bench with a small brass plate that read, "Sit here, listen, remember." "This is your place now," Dr. Brennan explained, "for as long as you want to keep coming, and someday when you can't anymore, it will be here for others to continue what you started." Elijah moved to the bench, running his hand along the smooth wood. He thought of the 12 names in his notebook, of the coat that had sheltered him through war and peace, of the long years of silence followed by this unexpected final chapter of his life. "Thank you," he said simply. As he took his seat, visitors began to enter, not just those gathered for the anniversary, but ordinary people coming to the museum on an ordinary Wednesday. A young girl approached first, her curiosity overcoming her shyness. "Is that your coat in the picture?" she asked, pointing to the large photograph. "Yes," Elijah replied, settling into his role with the ease of someone who had finally found his purpose. "Would you like to hear its story?" Around them, people gathered close, drawn not to the artifacts or displays, but to the quiet voice of the man who had carried memory when others had forgotten, who had preserved honor not in medals or monuments, but in the simple, enduring dignity of his presence. The coat would someday hang in a museum, but today, like Elijah himself, it remained where it belonged, not behind glass, but in the world, continuing its journey, carrying its stories forward into the light.